It's as close to time travel as we're gonna get. This Week in Music History with Marty Miller.
That'd be me. Hello there and welcome to the podcast. We hammer through a week of music history as quickly as we possibly can. Because I don't know about you, I don't really like very long podcasts. So if I can explain something very quickly, it'll get done. Unlike Bob Dylan this week in 2017, Bob set about trying to explain something. But even the setup and the explanation took a while.
I'm going to try to articulate that to you, and most likely it will go in a roundabout way. But I hope what I say will be worthwhile and purposeful.
The Beatles were at a loose end this week and messing about as sessions drag on back in 1970. And also in 1970, a huge album hits the top spot, featuring Neil Young.
Oh, I thought it'd be cool to play with Stephen again, and the other guys were great singers.
Zipping through a week in a matter of minutes. This Week in Music History, the podcast.
Do you have a big singles collection? In 1949, the record company RCA Victor introduced this week the 45 RPM, the single record, which had been in development since 1940. The 7-inch disc was designed to compete with the long-playing record that Columbia, a different recording company, brought out back in 1948.
You're listening to The Sleeping Beauty, Tchaikovsky's beautiful ballet music, on the new distortion-free RCA Victor 45 RPM records. Listen, compare, and you too will agree that RCA Victor's 45 RPM record is the finest and best ever made.
This week in 1967, what a horrible sound. Jimi Hendrix set fire to his guitar while playing live on stage. The Fender Strat, burned on stage by Hendrix, then sold in 2008 for 280,000 quid. That was at an auction of rock memorabilia. But here, this is how that guitar sounded while in flames. Couldn't actually make this up. On April Fool's Day 1984, Marvin Gaye was shot dead by his father at their home in Los Angeles in California.
Singer Marvin Gaye was shot to death on the eve of his 45th birthday. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was booked on suspicion of murder and ordered to undergo psychiatric tests.
This Week in Music History, a week in less than 10 minutes.
In 2004 this week, a fellow called Paul Atkinson, he was a guitarist with the Zombies. He died at age 58 due to liver and kidney disease. But after the Zombies, he became an A&R executive, an artist and repertoire man, working for Columbia and RCA, discovering and signing bands like ABBA, Bruce Hornsby, Mr. even Judas Priest. And the best Zombies tune ever? Got to be this one.
Time of the season for loving.
This week in 2017, after months of uncertainty and even controversy, I don't really remember what the controversy was actually. Was it just that he was getting a prize in literature? Bob Dylan finally accepted his 2016 Nobel Prize in literature. Here's Bob Dylan.
When I received the Nobel Prize for Literature, I got to wondering exactly how my songs related to literature. I wanted to reflect on it and see where the connection was. I'm going to try to articulate that to you, and most likely it will go in a roundabout way. But I hope what I say will be worthwhile and purposeful.
Back in 1970 this week, Phil Spector completed final editing and mixing for the Beatles' Let It Be album 16 months after it had begun. Now, that was far from the George Martin days where he would record, mix, release at least 4 albums in one day. Now, that technically never happened, but I'm just trying to portray the work ethic of somebody like George Martin.
When I was younger, so much younger than today, I never needed anybody's help in any. But now these days I'm not so self-assured. Now I find I change my mind, I'll open up the door. Help me!
Down! This Week in Music History, A week in less than 10 minutes.
1990, Nirvana went into a studio in Wisconsin to start work on demo versions of some songs that would become rather well known. In 1969 this week, The Doors' Jim Morrison turned himself into the FBI in LA. He had been charged on 6 counts of lewd behaviour and public exposure at a concert in Miami on March 2nd of 1969.
President of the Greater Miami Crime Commission, I'm calling upon the Dade County Grand Jury and the State Attorney's Office to immediately take criminal action against those that were responsible for the deplorable condition and situation that occurred at the Dade County Auditorium this past weekend, when the group known as the Doors, the rock and roll group, attempted to precipitate a riot.
2015 this week, Bob Burns, the American drummer who was in the original lineup of Lynyrd Skynyrd, died in a car crash when his car struck a tree. Silly Bob wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And Skynyrd were a rather unlucky band over the years, weren't they? Plane crashes and whatnot.
Bob Burns, the original drummer of the legendary rock band Lynyrd Skynyrd, has died. He was killed in a car crash in Georgia. Now, according to the Georgia State Patrol, the crash happened just before midnight on Tower Ridge Road in Bartow County near Cartersville. Burns was alone at the time of the crash. Officials say his car left the road on a tight curve and hit a tree. Troopers say he was not wearing a seatbelt at the time and he died at the scene. Burns helped establish Lynyrd Skynyrd back in '64. He was part of some of their biggest hits, including Free Bird. He was 64 years old.
Finally, this week in 1970, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young went to number 1 on the US album chart with the brilliant Deja Vu. This was the first album which saw Neil Young joining Crosby, Stills and Nash.
Neil had begun to establish himself as a solo artist, but the chance to team up with his old Buffalo Springfield partner was too tempting to resist.
Oh, I thought it'd be cool to play with Steven again, and the other guys were great singers and had their own songs and everything. But I really felt like I had some unfinished stuff with Steven that we play together, and we needed to do more of that.
And there you have it, boys and girls, the week of March 31st until April 4th in music history. Did you learn anything? Gosh, I hope so. We get through a week of music history in less than 10 minutes every week on the podcast. My name is Marty Miller. Thanks so much for listening.
Zipping through a week in a matter of minutes. This Week in Music History, the podcast.